One of the things I got to thinking about as I was reflecting on your book, I considered the difference between organisms and cities, the differences that we discussed. And at first pass, you sort of say that, companies are more like organisms. They're finite, they're mortal, and they die. And then I started to think about some modern companies, especially the bigger tech companies, the
Yeah.
Amazons, the Googles, the Apples. And, I'm here sitting in Seattle, and Amazon essentially has taken over entire blocks of
Okay.
downtown Seattle. They have
Yeah.
campuses where you work and you live effectively.
Yep.
You can get your laundry and your haircut at work. And so, are some of these companies becoming more city like in their organization? And could that potentially allow them to unlock the potential for open ended growth?
Well, this is a question that comes up a lot, actually. And when I do talk to people in that world, and indeed in the very world that you just talked about, namely Amazon. Um, and well, let's see, I'm on slightly awkward ground here, but um, the I'll say this, that there are some CEOs of companies, and Bezos being one of them,
Hmm.
that understands this phenomenon we've just been talking about, and the finiteness of companies. The companies are fragile and have a finite lifetime. And I didn't say, by the way, the data tells us that the, so to speak, the average lifespan of a company in the United States that's publicly traded, that means it's already gone through the gestation period of posting on the New York Stock Exchange, for example, is only 10 years.
Hmm.
Um, that's all you can expect of a company. Now, some companies may live 100 or 200 years, of course, there's great variance, and some may go bust after 1 year. Um, but, and so the question is, one of the things I've speculated about, and it is speculation because we don't have the data on the internal mechanisms of companies. So it comes from both reading case studies and talking to major CEOs of major companies and others in their administration. Is I've speculated on why this happens, why it is that companies die. Because they, first of all, even though they may behave like organisms in that sense, in the sense we just described, that is, they stop growing and then die, the mechanism is different. It's not, blood flowing through arteries and wearing out the arteries, although there might be some analog to that. It's much more, I believe, to do with the change that inevitably happens to a company as it ages, and that is going from something that's small and can move fast, is dominated by ideas,
Hmm.
is dominated by, ideas for its product range and space, and is very innovative, typically at the beginning. But then as it grows, inevitably, usually anyway, the product space narrows because it has to respond to the market. So some things that it thought were very sexy and innovative actually doesn't sell. Well, you can't go on producing it. Whereas things that you thought were somehow mundane, like Bezos and Amazon, something that was a side issue, doing this stuff on the web and so on, turned out to be the thing that's made
Hmm.
him essentially the richest man in the world, which is extraordinary. So, you have to respond to that. But of course, what that does in the vast majority of cases, it locks you in. And so you get locked in to, a certain way of doing business, a certain product space, certain narrowness. And that gets coupled with the more and more encroachment of bureaucracy and administration
Hmm.
that is inevitable because you're getting a bigger company. You have to have, you have all these both external laws that you have to pay. You have to pay your taxes. You have all these HR laws, all these safety laws. Then the company itself starts imposing its own laws to make sure those laws are obeyed, and so on. And the whole thing builds up so that we have this image of the company that it's basically the bureaucracy and administration, and the innovative, productive part becomes kind of secondary to that. I mean, that's sort of a cartoon version of what happens. And what that means is that it becomes somewhat ossified. And when the externalities change, the company cannot adjust. Or if the competition, something new happens, competition comes along, you can't move the battleship fast enough, and the company goes under. And that's the typical kind of life history of companies, successful companies that become very large and are unable to adapt. They're simply unable to adapt fast enough. And so now cities are quite different, even though they're also a socioeconomic organization, because they're really not top down. Of course, they have to have administrations and bureaucracies, clearly. You have to have something to manage much of the infrastructure. But cities are quite the opposite. They're open-ended. Great cities allow new things all the time to be developing. New York is maybe the greatest city in the world, because when you go there, you feel you can accomplish anything. I mean, that's sort of the image, to leave the farm and go to New York because I can be free and explore. I can become a great dancer. I can invent this new thing, and so on.
Yeah. Anyone can move there.
Sorry?
Anyone can move there.
Anyone can move there. And that's Silicon Valley took over that within, the modern paradigm that we have. And I often say this, and maybe I shouldn't, but when you go to New York, one of the things that you see, and San Francisco is another innovative city, homeless people. Seattle, my God, homeless people, and it's awful and terrible, and crazy people walking on the streets, or people talking to themselves and so on. And the thing that's amazing about that is that they provide a boundary for the rest of us. We are sort of free to move right up to that edge of being sort of crazy and different and not fitting in quite in the right way, and so on. It's symbolic and metaphorical, but you can't do that in a company. You don't have the analog to that in a company. Companies are extraordinarily intolerant of having people that are different, that don't quite fit, that are bucking the system, that aren't doing what they're told, and so on. And even Google, which presented itself as that image, the MIT graduate living in the basement who never washes and so on, that was kind of the image they projected, and they could do anything. That was never really true. It might have been sort of true at the beginning with Google, actually, but now it's sort of like many other companies. Except, go ahead.
The HR function of a company is very much designed, and it's one of its primary purposes, other than just keeping track of who's hired and how much they're being paid and those things, is really to create a culture, a set of rules that everyone follows.
Absolutely. And of course, cities have cultures, but it's so gray and so broad, relatively speaking. And so a great city, people are attracted. Innovative cities are ones that have allowed innovative people to come and create. And and I think it's very hard. And I think that is the role of mayors and administrations, are to facilitate that in a way that is constructive. Of course, it can become destructive, but many cities have been extraordinary at doing that, and companies have been terrible at doing that, and they freak out when things get rough and they realize they haven't innovated, they haven't allowed things to develop, and so on. Now, one of the things that's developed in recent years, it was always there, but much more so, is that, especially in Silicon Valley, IT companies, is buying up companies, of course, to bring in that innovation. And I think that's only been marginally successful. I don't think it's not organic. It has worked. I mean, what was it? Facebook brought Instagram, for example. It didn't invent it, but that's presumably been successful. But many of these other little companies that they bought up, and sometimes they buy them up, of course, in a traditional way of suppressing new ideas rather than innovating because they feel threatened. So it's a complicated process. But now I want to go to the very hub of your question, which is the Amazons and the Googles and so on that provide something that cities have provided in the past, and well, present too, of course. They provide a certain infrastructure. I mean, Google was the first to do this in providing, childcare and free meals, and sort of you can almost sleep there and live there. And they were having maybe some problems, even with people sort of moving in, and so on. Amazon has now done it, as you say, in Seattle by building, these housing for people and so on, which other companies have done, of course. Now, I don't think that's going to do it. I don't think that is, it may have some of the trappings of a city, but I don't think so. I don't think it will have the essence of a city. And I say that because in the 19th century, I mean, that's what companies did, especially industrial companies, coal mining companies. After all, here, there are towns, of course, that are company, the company town, the company store. So they were, but, they didn't survive in the end. And I think that's going to be true of these IT companies. That is, they will not survive because of this. They will only survive if they can somehow, which is extraordinarily difficult, encourage and engender what a city can do, which is this much more open, transparent way of allowing sort of rogue people to move in. I mean, that's how Silicon Valley started, after all. The people that weren't going to go to IBM or whatever, who had crazy, what might have been considered crazy ideas at the time.
Well, this does sound like, I immediately think of Google's Moonshot Lab. They've essentially taken a pile of, they essentially take a pile of money and say, you people go over there, don't break anything, but feel free to just tinker with whatever you think is interesting.
Yes, and I think that's been mixed. I mean, it has been, there's no question that's stimulated by this kind of idea, that can you have either, a piece of you that is unfettered. Better still would be to spawn a company that in fact is completely independent of you somehow, which then kind of means that if they're independent of you. So the question is, how much independence do they need in order to really be self-sustained in their innovative qualities, without feeling beholden? Because there's a big psychological side to this, as being part of it. And I know that from people at Google. I mean, it's highly non-trivial. And so I don't know. I don't think there's a simple solution. And I had been thinking, by the way, that this was not possible. That is, you can't actually have a company operating in the free market system that we have, that it operates like a city, or even a piece of it, that it just is not going to work. I have backed off from that. I may be wrong on that, but I don't know. The jury's out. There aren't enough examples. And I'm not at all sure that companies, even if they do things like the Google Moonshot, really are able to let go. They're very much like parents and children, and they always wanted them to be visiting them on the weekend, coming for Sunday dinner, or giving them presents, and so on. I think it's not so easy.